Alright, I am continuing to read excerpts from Ursula K LeGuin's Words That Matter while I'm hanging out at Malibu Creek State Park, and I just put on my sunblocks and my face is extra grimy. This piece is titled Disappearing Grandmothers. It was written in 2011, and it has not been previously published before this moment. I, the High Priestess, I, Enheduanna, there I raised the ritual basket, there I sang the shout of joy, but that man cast me among the dead. Enheduanna, ca. 2300 BCE, translated from the Sumerian by Betty Dishong Nader. What happens to the wind? I've been writing about it for decades now, the masculine orientation of discussion of books and authors in the press. Literature is now taught at least as often by women as by men, though the percentage of women professors drops as the prestige of the position and the institution rises. The feminist theory has played a strong part in shaping recent literary thinking and curricula, but all that is literally academic. To the leaders of critical opinion, to the establishers of rank and value of the general public, to the establishers of rank and value for the general public, to the cannoneers, male value and male achievement remain both the standard and the norm, which means that the canon of literature remains persistently, inflexibly, though now more subtly exclusive of women. I'm aware of 4 common techniques or devices, often, though not always, employed quite unconsciously, for excluding women's fiction from the literary canon book by book, author by author. These devices are denigration, omission, exception, and disappearance. The cumulative effect is the continuing marginalization of women's writing. Denigration. Once bald and forthright, denigration of women's writing now seldom comes right out as misogyny. Only imitators of the flaunting masculinist mystique of Hemingway and Mailer still treat all women's writing as second-rate, beneath notice. But assumptions can be made without being stated. I don't know of a reviewer these days who would drag out Johnson's comparison of a woman writing, preaching actually, with a dog walking on its hind legs, or shriek with Hawthorne at the thought of an army of scribbling women grimly advancing on him. The prejudice goes unspoken, the bias is shown by omission. Critics can dismiss whole genres unread if they are associated with women. If mysteries or war novels are brushed off as contemptuously as romance commonly is, or if a male-centered genre got a label as contemptuous as chick lit, there would be indignant protest. Many women call certain types of macho writing pricklet, but I haven't seen the term used in criticism yet. A patronizingly jock-killer tone often serves to denigrate the woman author. Women's writing may be called charming, elegant, poignant, sensitive, but is very seldom called powerful or rugged or masterful. The fact of an author's gender seems to dominate the journalistic mind, gender being read as sexual attractiveness. It's rare to find any discussion of George Eliot that doesn't mention that she was plain. The New York Times obituary of Colleen McCullough, author of The Thornbirds, included the same tasteful and relevant information. Live or dead, male authors are discussed without mentioning that they are or were ugly or unattractive men, but the sin of not having a pretty face is held against women even when they're dead. Comparing a book written by a woman to work by other women, but not to work by men, is a subtle and effective form of denigration. It allows the reviewer never to say a woman's book is better than a man's, and helps keep women's achievements safely out of the mainstream, off in the hen coop. Omission. Periodicals almost universally review more books by men than by women, at more length. Women's books are reviewed by either men or women, but men's books are reviewed very much more often by men. Books by women are often grouped together in a joint review, while men's books are reviewed individually. The most outstanding technique of omission is, as you might expect, in the most directly competitive field, literary prizes. Prize juries commonly shortlist books by both men and women, but give the award to a man. Except for a prize limited to women authors, I've never seen a shortlist for any literary prize consisting only of women. I was on a jury once, which unanimously picked a shortlist of 4 women. Another juror, a woman, persuaded us that we had to bump one of the women and include a man, or we would be accused of prejudice and our prize would lack credibility. I'm very sorry that we let her persuade us. Shortlists consisting only of men used to be taken for granted, but are now rarer since they too may be accused of prejudice. To prevent protest, some women are included on the list. The prize, however, will go to one of the men. From 2 times out of 3 to 9 times out of 10, depending on the prize. Anthologies tend to show the same gender imbalance. A science fiction anthology recently published in England contained no stories by women. A fuss was made. The men responsible for the selection apologized by saying they had invited women to contribute, but it didn't work out. Then they just somehow didn't notice that all the stories were by men. Ever so sorry about that. Somehow one feels that all of the stories had been by women, they would have noticed. No. Somehow one feels that if all the stories had been by women, then they would have noticed. Exception. A novel by a man is very seldom discussed with any reference to the author's gender. A novel by a woman is very frequently discussed with reference to her gender. The norm is male. The woman is an exception to the norm, from which she is excluded. Exception and exclusion are practiced both in criticism and in reviewing. A critic forced to admit that, say, Virginia Woolf is a great English novelist, may take pains to show her as an exception, a wonderful fluke. The techniques of exception and exclusion are manifold. The woman writer is found not to be in the mainstream of English novels. Her writing is unique, but has no influence on later writers. She is the object of a cult. She is a charming, elegant, poignant, sensitive, fragile hothouse flower that should not be seen as competing with the rugged, powerful, masterful vigor of the male novelist. Joyce was almost instantly canonized. Woolf was either excluded from the canon or admitted grudgingly and with reservations for decades. It is quite arguable that To the Lighthouse, with its subtle and effective narrative techniques and devices, has been far more influential on later novelists or novel writing than Ulysses, which is a monumental dead end. Joyce, choosing silence, exile, cunning, led a sheltered life, taking responsibility for nothing but his own writing and career. Woolf led a fully engaged life in her own country, in an extraordinary circle of intellectually, sexually, and politically active people, and she knew, read, reviewed, and published other authors all her grown life. Joyce is a fragile person. Woolf the tough one. Joyce is the cult object and the fluke. Woolf the continuously fertile influence central to the 20th century novel. But centrality is the last thing accorded to a woman by the cannoneers. Women must be left to the margins. Even when a woman novelist is admitted to be a first-rate artist, the techniques of exclusion still operate. Jane Austen is vastly admired, yet she is less often considered as an exemplar than as unique, inimitable, a wonderful fluke. She cannot be disappeared, but she is not fully included. Denigration, omission, and exception during a writer's lifetime are preparations for her disappearance after her death. Disappearance. I use the word in its active Argentine sense and in full awareness of its connotations. Of all the crass or subtle techniques used to diminish women's writing, disappearance is the most effective. Once she is silent and powerless, male solidarity quickly closes ranks against the outsider. Female solidarity, or the instinct of justice, is rarely strong enough to force the ranks back open, and if the effort succeeds, it must continue endlessly, for the male ranks keep effortlessly and endlessly reclosing. I've written before of instances of disappearance that particularly gall me. Elizabeth Gaskell and Margaret Oliphant. Both, even now, are often referred to only as Mrs., the title indicating their gender and their social condition. We do not refer to Mr. Dickens or Mr. Trollope. Gaskell and Oliphant are well known, popular, respected, and were taken seriously while they lived. When they lived, they were promptly disappeared, or when they died, they were promptly disappeared. Gaskell's work was reduced to the sweet Cranford. Social historians of the Victorian era kept reading her novels as documentation, as they did Dickens, but this did not count among the literary cannoneers. Oliphant's work was wholly forgotten, but for one novel, Miss Majoribanks, not her best, mentioned by historians of literature, but not kept in print. The injustice of these dismissals is as painful as their wastefulness. There really weren't so many excellent Victorian novelists that we can afford to throw out two of them simply because they weren't men. Yet, what other reason can be given for the disappearance of their novels? Gaskell is now fairly well reinstated, thanks to feminists in film. Oliphant is not. Why? She and Trollope have a good many similarities. I assume it's Trollope, I hope it's that. Their limitations are obvious, but not fatal. Both wrote solidly entertaining novels, psychologically canny and perceptive, which are also fascinating social documents. But only hers vanished. Changing styles put Trollope out of fashion. But he had a great revival during the Second World War, when Britons homesick for the old imaginary certainties found them in his books. Nobody remembered or revived Oliphant until the 1970s, when female solidarity in the form of feminist criticism and publishers rescued some of her books, at least temporarily. The rawest case I know of actively disappearing a woman writer is Wallace Stegner's treatment of Mary Hallock Foote. He took the setting characters, the story of his novel Angle of Repose, from her autobiography, which was published as a Victorian gentlewoman in the far west. Even his title is taken from a sentence in her book. Stegner degraded the character of the author he stole from, making her into an adulterous wife whose carelessness kills her child, a cruel travesty of the actual relationships recounted in the autobiography, the manner of the daughter's death, the depth of the mother's grief. Throughout, Stegner coarsened and cheapened Foote's perceptions of people and landscapes. Nowhere did he mention Foote or her book's title, deliberately hiding the fact that she was a published author. The only hint he gave of his source was a sentence in the acknowledgement thanking some friends of his descendants of Foote for the loan of their grandmother. Grandmothers are much easier to handle than women who write. Grandmothers don't even have names. Of course, artists borrow constantly from one another, but what Stegner did was not borrowing, it was expropriation. I would call it plagiarism. It is clear that to him, Foote's book simply did not exist in its own right. It was merely raw material for him, the man, the admired novelist, the Stanford professor, to use as he chose. To him, Foote herself did not exist. She was an object for his use. Rob the grave, just don't say who you left buried in it. Many who have read Mary Foote's book think it better than Stegner's. Her story was based selectively on events of her own life, recounted with emotional control and accuracy. She drew her pioneers and engineers of the Western landscape from life, not secondhand. Stegner sensationalized and conventionalized the setting, the emotions, and the characters, but he was a famous male writer playing the part of a famous male writer to the hilt. It worked. He got a Pulitzer for it. His book continues to be printed, praised, and studied. Mary Foote was a woman writer with a moderate popular reputation and no pretension to fame. Her book disappeared. Though women's solidarity during the second wave of feminism was enough to get it reprinted after a century of neglect, who knows about it? Who reads it? Who teaches it? Who will think it matters? I'm thinking now of a woman writer who died not long ago, one who is, I fear, particularly vulnerable to being disappeared. A singularly original and powerful storyteller and poet, Grace Paley. The problem with Paley is that she was truly and genuinely unique. Not a fluke, certainly, but Like so many women writers, she was not part of any major recognized school or trend in fiction or poetry acknowledged by the male-centered literary establishment. And unlike so many men writers, she was not much interested in the advancement of her ego. She was ambitious, all right, fiercely so, but her ambition was to further social justice in her time. I fear that if women critics, feminist writers, fair-minded scholars, and teachers and lovers of literature do not make conscious and consistent effort to keep Paley's work visible, studied, taught, read, and reprinted, it will be quietly brushed aside within the next few years. It will lapse out of print. It will be forgotten, while the work of lesser writers will be kept alive simply because they were men. It won't do. You really can't go on letting good writers be disappeared and buried because they weren't men, while writers who should be left to rot in peace are endlessly resurrected, the zombies of criticism and curriculum, because they weren't women. I'm no beauty, but don't give me a headstone that said she was plain. I'm a grandmother, but don't give me a headstone that says somebody's grandmother. If I have a headstone, I want my name on it. Far more than that, I want my name on books that are judged not by the gender of the writer, but by the quality of the writing and the value of the work. Seems reasonable.